Every seat was full, except the one that mattered most. 11 games. 11 times he searched CAD and found nothing. They said he stopped caring. They said he just disappeared. But nobody asked where he really was. Working, he always said. Just working. But some kinds of work you're never supposed to see. Where is your dad?
Is he coming?
While his son slept, he was scrubbing floors 2 miles away. 2 jobs, 0 complaints, 1 secret. He never missed because he stopped loving him. He missed because he never stopped fighting for him. And today, Hayes, he finally made it.
The bleachers were full that Saturday morning, packed with mothers holding thermoses of coffee and fathers filming every pitch on their phones. And in the middle of all that noise sat one empty seat that everybody in the small town of Cedar Hollow had started to notice. It belonged to Marcus Bennett, and his 10-year-old son Tyler stood at home plate, searching the crowd one more time before the umpire called play ball, hoping against hope that this would finally be the day his father walked through that chain-link gate. If you have ever felt invisible in a crowd of people who love someone else's parent more than your own, if you have ever swallowed disappointment so many times it started to taste normal, then stay with this story until the very end, because what looks like abandonment on the surface is not always what it seems, and the truth Tyler was about to discover would either break this family apart forever or bind it together in a way no one saw coming. Before we go further, if stories about real love, real sacrifice, and the kind of quiet heroism nobody claps for move you, take a second to like this video and subscribe, because there is so much more heart in what happens next. Tyler gripped his bat and stepped into the box, his eyes flicking one last time toward the parking lot, half expecting the old silver pickup truck to come rattling around the corner the way it used to, back before things changed, back when his mother was still alive and Saturdays meant pancakes and box scores and his father's booming laugh from the third baseline. That truck never came. It hadn't come in 11 straight games. His teammates had their fathers there, cheering, filming, arguing with umpires about balls and strikes, and Tyler had learned to duck his head and pretend he didn't care when the other boys asked. Not unkindly, but with the particular cruelty of children who simply do not understand. "Where's your dad again?" He always gave the same answer. Working. It was true, and it was also the loneliest word he knew. 2 years earlier, life in the small yellow house on Maple Street had looked entirely different. Angela Bennett had been the son the whole family orbited around. A warm, quick-laughing woman who sang off-key while she cooked, and who never missed a single one of Tyler's Little League games, not one in 4 years of playing. Marcus worked steady hours back then at the regional distribution center, home every evening by 6, and on weekends the three of them were inseparable, packed into that silver truck for games, for fishing trips, for nothing at all except the joy of being together. Then came the diagnosis nobody saw coming, an aggressive illness that moved faster than the doctor's best efforts. And within 8 devastating months, Angela was gone, leaving behind a grieving husband and a heartbroken 8-year-old boy who did not yet have the words for what he had lost. What almost nobody in Cedar Hollow knew, because Marcus had never told a soul outside of one desperate, trembling conversation, was that in the final weeks of Angela's illness, when the medical bills had piled higher than either of them could have imagined, Marcus had turned to the one person he trusted without question, his wife's older brother, Ray Delgado. Ray had always presented himself as the successful one in the family. Sharp suits, a leased sedan that gleamed like it had never seen rain, a smile made for closing deals. When Angela passed, she left behind a modest life insurance policy, $32,000, meant to cover what the medical bills hadn't already swallowed, and to give Tyler a cushion for whatever the future held. Maybe even the surgery his cardiologist had quietly mentioned might be needed someday for the minor heart murmur they were monitoring. Grieving and overwhelmed, barely able to function through the fog of losing his wife, Marcus had asked Ray, a man who worked in finance, to help manage the funds responsibly while he found his footing again. "It seemed like the safest, most sensible choice in the world." "Family looks after family," Ray had said, squeezing Marcus's shoulder at the funeral reception, his voice thick with performed sincerity. "You don't have to think about the money right now. Let me handle it." For 8 months, Marcus didn't think about it because he couldn't. He was too busy learning how to braid nothing, because Tyler didn't need braids, but he was too busy learning how to be both parents at once, how to pack a lunch that wasn't just crackers, how to sit beside a sobbing 8-year-old at 2 in the morning and not fall apart himself. It wasn't until Tyler's pediatric cardiologist called to schedule a follow-up evaluation, mentioning the surgical consultation fund they had discussed, that Marcus finally called Ray to arrange a withdrawal. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted 4 full seconds before Ray started talking fast, words tumbling over each other about a downturn, a bad investment, a fund that was underperforming. Temporary, he kept saying. It's temporary, Marcus. I'll make it right. Marcus drove to Ray's office that same afternoon, and what he found was a hollowed-out account. $29,000 gone. Funneled, Marcus would later learn through a lawyer he could not afford to keep on retainer, into Ray's own failing side business and a gambling habit he'd hidden from every single member of the family for years. Marcus stood in that glass-walled office with his dead wife's brother, a man who had held his hand at her funeral, and felt something in his chest crack open that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with rage. He wanted to scream. He wanted to call the police right there on the spot. But then his phone buzzed with a text from the babysitter, a photo of Tyler grinning gap-toothed over a bowl of cereal, and Marcus understood in that instant that rage was a luxury he could not afford, not with a son who had already lost his mother and could not afford to lose the last shred of stability he had left, including an uncle who, whatever his sins, was still the only extended family Tyler had nearby. So Marcus did not scream. He did not call the police that day. He looked at Ray, said only, "You will pay every dollar of this back, and until you do, you are not welcome in my son's life." And he walked out, closing the door so quietly it was somehow louder than any slam could have been. That night was the night everything changed. Marcus sat at the kitchen table long after Tyler had fallen asleep, staring at a stack of bills that no longer had a safety net beneath them, and he made a decision that would define the next 2 years of his life. He would not tell Tyler what had happened. Not yet. Maybe not for years. A boy who had already buried his mother did not need to learn that his uncle had stolen from him, too, did not need one more reason to distrust the world. Instead, Marcus would simply work. He kept his day shift at the distribution center, and he took on a second job as an overnight janitorial supervisor at the very elementary school Tyler attended, mopping the same hallways his son walked every morning, scrubbing the same gymnasium where Tyler's class held their assemblies, all while Tyler slept at the neighbor's house down the street. A kind retired teacher named Mrs. Whitfield who had known Angela and who never once made Marcus feel like a burden for asking. The overnight shift started at 10 and ended at 6, which meant Marcus was catching perhaps 4 hours of sleep before dragging himself up to make breakfast, get Tyler to school, and then head to the warehouse for 8 more hours before doing it all again. Weekends were meant to be his recovery time, the only stretch where he might catch up on sleep enough to function, and it was precisely on Saturdays that Little League games were scheduled. For the first few months, Marcus tried to make both work happen, showing up exhausted, sometimes falling asleep sitting upright on the bleachers, embarrassing in its own quiet way. But then the warehouse cut overtime hours company-wide due to a slow season, and Marcus lost nearly $400 a month in income overnight, money he simply could not lose with a mortgage, a growing boy, and a mountain of debt from Angela's final medical bills still unpaid. He picked up a third source of income, a weekend landscaping crew that worked Saturday mornings for a property management company, 6:30 to 1, cash under the table, back-breaking work under a punishing sun, but it covered the gap. It also meant Tyler's games, every single one, fell during the exact hours Marcus was pushing a mower across some stranger's 3 acres of lawn. Tyler, of course, knew none of this. All he knew was that his father had once been the loudest voice on the third base line, and now his father was a name other parents whispered about with pity, a rumor that Marcus Bennett had checked out after his wife died, that he'd let his grief turn into neglect. Coach Daniels, a broad-shouldered former minor leaguer with a soft heart hidden under a gruff exterior, had heard the whispers too, and more than once he'd found himself defending a man he barely knew to parents who had already made up their minds. He noticed things, though. Things the gossiping parents didn't bother to notice. He noticed that Tyler's cleats, though a size too small, were always spotless. He noticed that Tyler never went without a snack in his bag, always packed with a napkin folded into a small, deliberate triangle, the kind of detail only a parent paying close, loving attention would think to include. He noticed one Tuesday evening at practice, headlights sweeping briefly across the outfield fence. A man in a landscaping company polo standing at the far edge of the parking lot for exactly 6 minutes, watching batting practice from a distance before climbing back into his truck and driving away without ever approaching the field. It happened more than once. Coach Daniels started watching for it, that flash of headlights, that solitary figure at the fence line, gone before anyone else noticed. He didn't say anything to Tyler, not wanting to raise a hope that might be crushed, but he began to form a picture in his mind of a father who was not absent by choice, and it troubled him deeply that the entire community had decided otherwise, without ever asking a single honest question. Tyler's curiosity, meanwhile, was curdling slowly into something closer to resentment. He started keeping a mental scoreboard of his own, an invisible one, tallying every missed game against his father, the way he tallied strikeouts against opposing pitchers. 11 games. 11 times he had scanned the crowd and found nothing. He stopped mentioning upcoming games at the dinner table, not because he didn't want his father there, but because the hope of asking and being let down again had become unbearable. One evening, exhausted from a double shift, Marcus came home to find Tyler's uniform balled up in the hamper instead of hung neatly the way Tyler usually treated it, a small act of defiance that spoke volumes. When Marcus asked what was wrong, Tyler simply said, "Nothing," in the flat, closed-off voice of a child who has decided that talking doesn't fix anything, and went to his room. It was Mrs. Whitfield who finally forced the reckoning, though she did not intend to. She had picked Tyler up from practice one Thursday because Marcus was working a landscaping emergency, a fallen tree limb that needed clearing before a client's event that weekend. And on the drive home, Tyler, staring out the window, asked her quietly whether she thought his dad even remembered he existed anymore. Mrs. Whitfield nearly pulled the car over. She had watched Marcus Bennett drag himself through her front door at 11 o'clock at night, more times than she could count, had seen him fall asleep standing up while buttoning his work jacket, had watched him decline a plate of dinner she offered because he said he didn't have time to eat before his next shift. She told Tyler, gently but firmly, that his father thought of nothing else, that in fact she suspected his father thought of little besides him, and that perhaps it was time somebody told Tyler the truth, because carrying a secret meant to protect a child sometimes ends up hurting that child more than the truth ever would. That night, Mrs. Whitfield sat Marcus down at his own kitchen table, the same table where he had once made the decision to shoulder everything silently, and told him plainly that his son believed he had stopped loving him. Marcus, a man who had not cried since the week of Angela's funeral, put his head in his hands and wept, not from exhaustion this time, but from the specific, devastating grief of realizing that his sacrifice had been so well hidden, it had curdled into something that looked from a 10-year-old's perspective, exactly like abandonment. He knew, sitting there, that the season's championship game was 2 Saturdays away, and that it fell during his landscaping shift, the one job he could least afford to skip because the property management company had already warned him twice about missed commitments. He also knew, with sudden and total clarity, that he could not miss it, not this one, not after everything. That night he called his landscaping supervisor and asked, humiliated but desperate, whether there was any way to shift his hours, to start before dawn instead of mid-morning, so he could finish before the first pitch. The supervisor, a gruff but not unkind man named Frank who had noticed Marcus's work ethic even if he'd never said so, agreed on the condition that Marcus make up the difference the following Sunday, doubling his hours in a single day. Marcus said yes before Frank had even finished the sentence. But sacrifice, Marcus was about to learn, does not always come from the direction you expect it, and the next obstacle arrived wearing a familiar, unwelcome face. Ray called him 3 days before the championship game, his voice syrupy with the particular desperation of a man who had run out of other options, explaining that he was behind on payments to a bookie who was no longer, being patient that he needed $400 by Friday or things could get, in his words, genuinely ugly. And that, as family, as Tyler's uncle, surely Marcus could find it in his heart to help one more time. The old Marcus, grieving and guilt-ridden and desperate to hold what remained of Angela's family together, might have found a way to scrape the money together despite everything. But 2 years of silent sacrifice had forged something harder and clearer in him. He told Ray calmly and without raising his voice that he had documentation of every dollar Ray had stolen, that he had spoken with a legal aid attorney about pursuing restitution, and that if Ray ever asked him for money again or came anywhere near Tyler without Marcus's explicit permission, that documentation would go to the district attorney's office the same day. He hung up before Ray could respond. It was not revenge in the way movies show it. No shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Just a quiet, immovable line drawn by a man who had finally decided his son's well-being outweighed his fear of family conflict. Ray, predictably, did not take the threat quietly. He showed up unannounced at the warehouse on Friday afternoon, cornering Marcus near the loading dock during his shift, alternating between wheedling apology and thinly veiled threats about what he might tell Tyler someday about his father's temper if Marcus didn't reconsider. It was, ironically, this confrontation that pushed Marcus past his final hesitation. He walked straight from that loading dock conversation to the legal aid office during his lunch break and signed the paperwork to formally pursue a civil claim against Ray for the misappropriated funds. The first concrete step toward the restitution Tyler deserved and toward closing, once and for all, the chapter of quiet suffering Marcus had carried alone. Saturday morning arrived gray and cool, perfect baseball weather. Marcus was on Frank's client's lawn by 5:15, working with a focus and speed he didn't know he still had in him, racing the sun and the clock in equal measure. Tyler, meanwhile, sat in the dugout during warm-ups, going through the motions, his heart not really in it, half listening to Coach Daniels' pep talk about heart and hustle while privately bracing for the 12th empty seat on the bleachers. What he didn't know was that Coach Daniels had spent the entire week quietly working a plan of his own, having finally pieced together enough of the truth from Mrs. Whitfield, whom he'd approached directly after noticing her at 3 separate practices, to understand exactly what kind of man Tyler's father actually was. Coach Daniels made sure that morning to save one particular seat at the very front of the bleachers, right along the fence closest to home plate, and told none of the parents whose curiosity he'd deflect all morning exactly why. At 8:52, 4 minutes before the top of the first inning, a battered work truck skidded into the gravel lot, and Marcus Bennett came sprinting across the field still in his grass-stained landscaping polo, dirt on his forearms, sweat on his brow, moving faster than a man who'd been mowing lawns since before dawn had any business moving. Tyler, standing at the on-deck circle, froze mid-swing when he saw him. For one terrible second he thought his eyes were playing tricks, the way they sometimes did when he stared too long at the empty bleachers, willing his father into existence out of pure longing. But this was real. His father reached the fence, breathless, and called his name, just his name, nothing else needed, and Tyler dropped his bat and ran, off the field mid-warm-up, straight into his father's arms in front of the entire team. The entire crowd, every parent who had ever whispered about Marcus Bennett, watching in stunned silence as a 10-year-old boy sobbed into his exhausted father's chest. There, in front of everyone, with no more strength left to hold the secret in, Marcus knelt down, held his son by the shoulders, and told him the truth, all of it, quietly enough that only Tyler could hear the details, but clearly enough that his tears told the story to everyone watching. He told him about Ray, about the money meant for Tyler's future that had disappeared, about the 2, sometimes 3 jobs he'd been working every single day for nearly 2 years, about standing at the edge of practice in the dark just to catch 6 minutes of his son swinging a bat because it was the only baseball he could afford to watch. He told him he was sorry, so deeply sorry, for letting Tyler believe, even for one single day, that he didn't matter more than anything else in the world. Tyler, through tears, asked the only question that mattered to a 10-year-old heart. "You didn't stop loving me?" And Marcus, holding his son's face in his rough, calloused hands, answered with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than words. "Not for 1 second. Not ever." The umpire, who had been quietly watching the whole scene unfold, called for a 2-minute delay, and not a single parent in the bleachers complained. Coach Daniels walked over, clapped Marcus on the shoulder, and said simply, "Go sit down, Bennett. Your boy's got a game to play, and you've got a game to watch." Marcus took the seat that had been saved for him all along, front row, right along the fence. And for the first time in 2 years, he watched his son step up to the plate with nothing hidden between them. Tyler played the best game of his young life that morning, driving in the go-ahead run in the 4th inning with a double that sent his father leaping off the bleachers, and closing out the championship in the final inning with a diving catch in center field that had the whole crowd on its feet. But the score, in the end, mattered less than the sight of a father and son walking off that field together afterward, Tyler's arm slung around his father's waist, Marcus's hand resting on his son's shoulder, both of them talking and laughing in a way the town of Cedar Hollow hadn't seen from the Bennett family in 2 long years. The story didn't end neatly with that single Saturday, because real life rarely does. Ray, faced with a civil suit and the very real threat of criminal charges for misappropriation of a minor's inheritance, agreed to a repayment plan under the supervision of the court, the first 3 installments of which arrived grudgingly but on time over the following months. It would take years to recover the full amount, and Marcus knew he might never see all of it. But the acknowledgement mattered almost as much as the money. A formal, undeniable record that what had happened to his family was real and was wrong. Marcus scaled back to 2 jobs instead of 3 once the landscaping debt to Frank was settled, choosing to prioritize evenings and weekends with Tyler over every extra dollar he could squeeze from his own exhaustion. He missed exactly 0 games for the remainder of that season, and the one after that, showing up in whatever state his other jobs left him in, sometimes still in his work boots, but always there, always in that same seat by the fence that Coach Daniels never let anyone else take. What Tyler carried forward from that season was not simply a championship trophy, though it sat proudly on his dresser for years afterward, but a lesson far more permanent. That love is not always loud. That sacrifice often hides in silence rather than shouting itself from the rooftops. And that the people who seem absent are sometimes fighting the hardest, most invisible battles imaginable on your behalf. He would tell this story himself years later, a grown man, to his own teammates and eventually to his own children. About the season his father missed 11 games and then never missed another one again. About the uncle whose betrayal nearly broke their family, and the truth that ultimately saved it. About a mother whose memory had quietly shaped every hard decision her husband made in her absence. And every single time he told it, he ended it the same way his father had ended it that Saturday morning at the fence, with the same certainty passed down like an inheritance far more valuable than any insurance policy. Love that is real does not disappear when it is hard to see. Sometimes it is simply working overtime, in the dark, so that the people it protects never have to carry the weight themselves. If this story reached something real in you, make sure to share it with someone who needs the reminder. Subscribe for more stories like this one. And remember that the people who show up quietly are often the ones showing up the hardest. In the weeks that followed the championship, word of what had truly happened to the Bennett family spread through Cedar Hollow the way small-town stories always do, quietly at first and then all at once, until the same parents who had once whispered judgments on the bleachers found themselves showing up at Marcus's door with casseroles and offers to help, embarrassed by how quickly they had assumed the worst of a man they barely knew. Mrs. Whitfield told anyone who would listen that she had never in her years of teaching met a parent who sacrificed so much so quietly, and Coach Daniels made it a point, at the team's end-of-season banquet, to say a few words about a certain father who had taught the entire league something about what real dedication looked like. Words that made Marcus duck his head and Tyler beam with a pride that had nothing to do with baseball statistics. Frank, the landscaping supervisor, quietly adjusted Marcus's schedule going forward without being asked, making sure Saturday mornings were protected whenever a game was on the calendar. A small kindness that meant more to Marcus than any raise could have. The legal process with Ray dragged on slower than either Marcus or his attorney would have liked, tangled in the particular bureaucracy that follows family disputes even when the wrongdoing is clear and documented. But Marcus found that simply having taken the step mattered more than he expected. He no longer flinched when Ray's name came up at family gatherings, no longer carried the low simmer of resentment he'd swallowed for 2 years, because he had finally done something rather than nothing, had finally protected his son's future in the open instead of in secret. Ray, for his part, remained mostly absent from their lives, a distant relative reduced to court-mandated monthly payments and the occasional stiff, formal email, and Tyler, when he was old enough to understand the full story a few years later, felt surprisingly little anger toward the uncle who had wronged them, only a quiet gratitude that his father had shielded him from the worst of it for as long as he possibly could. What stayed with Tyler most, long after the trophy had gathered dust and the particulars of that championship game had faded into a pleasant blur, was a single image he returned to again and again throughout his life. His father, sprinting across a gravel parking lot in grass-stained work clothes, breathless and dirt-streaked, choosing him over exhaustion, over money, over every reasonable excuse a person could have used to stay home and rest. It became the measuring stick against which Tyler judged every kind of love he encountered afterward. The standard his father had set without ever intending to set a standard at all, simply by refusing to let his son believe, even for one more Saturday, that he had been forgotten. And on the mornings when Tyler, years later, felt tempted to cut a corner, to choose comfort over commitment to the people who mattered most, he would think of that empty seat that used to sit on the bleachers, and of the man who filled it not with words, but with 2 exhausting, invisible years of overtime. And he would choose, every single time, to show up. That following spring, when tryouts for the next season rolled around, Marcus stood at the fence during the very first practice, no longer hiding at a distance in a landscaping truck, but standing openly among the other parents, cheering just as loudly as anyone else on that field. Tyler glanced over between drills, found his father's face immediately in the small crowd, and felt something settle inside him that had been unsettled for 2 long years. A quiet certainty that no matter what jobs his father worked or what hardships came next, he would never again have to search a crowd wondering if he mattered. Some lessons take a season to learn and a lifetime to keep, and the Bennett family, scarred but unbroken, carried that one forward together, one Saturday at a time.